The moment I realized my sister had taken $2,000 from my account, my first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Kind that makes you stare at numbers longer than necessary, hoping they'll rearrange themselves if you blink hard enough. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, laptop open, coffee already cold, doing what I did every Sunday night. Checking my balances. Making sure nothing unexpected had slipped through. Rent was coming up. Utilities were due. Everything was tight but planned. Then I saw it. A transfer I didn't recognize. $2,000. Gone. First, I assumed it was fraud. A glitch. Some error I could fix with a phone call and a hold queue. I checked the details. The transfer wasn't external. It wasn't a scam. It was internal. Same bank. Same family-linked access point we'd set up years ago just in case. My stomach dropped. I already knew the answer before I admitted it to myself. I opened the transaction history again, slower this time. Date. Time. Authorization source. There was only one person who could have done it. My sister. I sat back in my chair and laughed once, quietly. Not because it was funny. 'Cause disbelief sometimes comes out sounding like humor. I hadn't given permission. There was no conversation. No warning. Just a silent decision made on my behalf. $2,000 might not sound catastrophic to some people. To me, it was everything. It was the difference between stability and panic. Between catching up and falling behind. Between sleeping and lying awake, calculating worst-case scenarios. My hands started shaking slightly as I picked up my phone. I didn't call my sister first. I already knew how that conversation would go. She would laugh it off. Tell me she meant to mention it. Say she'd pay it back soon. Soon was a word that had never meant anything concrete in my family. Instead, I called my mom. 'Cause somewhere deep down I still believed there was a line. A boundary that couldn't be crossed without consequence. She answered on the third ring, cheerful, distracted. "Hey, honey," she said. "What's up?" I didn't ease into it. "I just saw a transfer from my account," I said. $2,000. "Did you know about this?" There was a pause. Not shock. Not confusion. Recognition. "Oh," she said lightly. "That." My chest tightened. "That?" I repeated. "Yes," she continued, unfazed. "Your sister needed some help this week." She was short. I gripped the edge of the table. "She took it from my account," I said. "I didn't agree to that." Another pause. This one shorter. More annoyed. "Don't be dramatic," my mom said. "It's not stealing. It's sharing." The word landed heavier than the money ever could have. Sharing. As if my finances were communal property. As if consent was optional when it came to me. As if my effort, my work, my planning existed for redistribution whenever someone else decided they needed it more. "I needed that money," I said quietly. There it was. The truth. No accusation. No raised voice. Just fact. My mom sighed. The kind of sigh reserved for children who don't understand how the world works. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do." And in that moment, something shifted. Not snapped. Shifted. Because I realized this wasn't about $2,000. It was about how easily my boundaries disappeared the moment they became inconvenient. How quickly my needs were reframed as obstacles. How my independence had once again been used as justification for taking from me without asking. I hung up the phone without arguing. Not because I agreed. 'Cause I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. After I hung up, I didn't move for a long time. Not because I was stunned. 'Cause my body was trying to decide whether this was a crisis or just another adjustment I would have to absorb quietly. That hesitation told me everything. If something truly shocking had happened, my reaction would have been immediate. Panic. Anger. Action. Instead, there was a familiar stillness. Kind that comes from recognizing a pattern you've lived inside for years. I opened my laptop again and pulled up my budget. Not to fix it. To see the damage clearly. Rent was still due. Utilities didn't care about family dynamics. My emergency buffer, already thin, was now gone. $2,000 wasn't just a number. It was margin. It was breathing room. It was the difference between solving problems calmly and spiraling through them alone. I ran the math 3 times as if repetition might change the outcome. It didn't. The reality sat there, unmoved by my frustration. I thought about calling my sister anyway. Not to yell. To ask what she thought she was doing. But I stopped myself. Because the question wasn't really about her behavior. It was about permission. She wouldn't have done this if she didn't believe she had it. And she wouldn't have believed she had it if it hadn't been granted implicitly over and over again. I remembered the conversation years ago when we linked our accounts temporarily. Just in case. For emergencies. Mom had framed it as practical. A safety net. What she hadn't said was that the net only went one way. I had always been the stable one. Careful one. The one with decent credit and predictable habits. Linking accounts hadn't been about mutual support. It had been about access. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. The anger arrived then. Not explosive. Controlled. Dense. Kind that presses on your chest instead of burning through your veins. I wasn't angry that my sister needed help. I was angry that my consent hadn't mattered. That my effort was treated like a resource instead of something earned and protected. That the people who preached responsibility to me had no problem overriding it when it suited them. My phone buzzed. A message from my sister. As if on cue. Hey, it read. 3 Ys. Casual. Carefree. I heard you noticed the transfer. I was gonna tell you. I'll pay you back, don't worry. No apology. No acknowledgement of boundaries. Just an assumption of compliance. I stared at the message longer than I should have. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Anything I said in that moment would be shaped by emotion instead of clarity. So I put the phone face down and stood up. I paced my apartment slowly, grounding myself in physical movement. Counting steps. Breathing deliberately. Letting the initial surge settle into something usable. I thought about how often this had happened in smaller ways. Money borrowed and returned late. Decisions made about my time without asking. Plans changed because I was expected to adapt. Each incident minor on its own. Together, unmistakable. This wasn't sharing. Sharing requires agreement. This was entitlement dressed up as family closeness. And my mom's response hadn't just excused it. It had normalized it. I sat back down and wrote out a list. Not of expenses. The facts. My sister took money without permission. My mother justified it. My needs were dismissed. This was not an accident. This was a system functioning exactly as designed. Seeing it laid out that way stripped the situation of its emotional fog. It wasn't chaotic. It was consistent. And consistency meant predictability. Predictability meant I could plan. I opened my banking app and changed the permissions. Removed access. Added security layers I'd never thought I needed with family. Each click felt heavy but necessary. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was correcting a structural flaw. A flaw that had cost me more than money over the years. As I finished, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that this couldn't happen again. Sadness that it had happened at all. that it had been so easy. I checked my phone again. Another message from my sister. Mom says you're upset, but you'll get over it. You always do. There it was. The family myth in one sentence. My resilience repurposed as permission. I didn't respond. Not because I was afraid of conflict. Because I was done participating in conversations that required me to shrink my reality to keep the peace. Instead, I opened a notes app and wrote one sentence. This is the last time my stability will be treated as communal property. I didn't know exactly how I would enforce that yet, but writing it made it real. I looked around my apartment. Small. Modest. Entirely mine. Every piece of it paid for with effort and discipline. I realized something quietly profound. If they could take from me so easily, then my first responsibility wasn't to explain myself. It was to protect what I had built. 'Cause no one else was going to do that for me. And that realization, heavier than the loss itself, marked the true beginning of this story. Once the immediate shock settled, a deeper awareness crept in. Not panic. Recognition. I had been here before, just in different shapes, different amounts, different justifications. But the same underlying rule always applied. What was mine was negotiable. What they needed was urgent. And whatever imbalance followed was mine to absorb quietly. I sat on the couch and replayed the conversation with my mom over and over. Not the words themselves. The tone. The ease with which she said sharing, like it was obvious. Like I was naive for expecting consent. Like boundaries were optional when they inconvenienced family. That ease hurt more than anger ever could. 'Cause ease means practice. Means this logic had been used before. Often. It meant I had trained them without realizing it. By fixing things. By adapting. By figuring it out every single time. I thought about the countless moments I had stepped in to cover gaps. Late fees I'd quietly paid off. Groceries I'd bought just this once. Time I'd rearranged. Plans I'd canceled. Each time telling myself it was temporary. Each time believing reciprocity would appear eventually. It never did. 'Cause systems don't change when they're convenient. They change when they're interrupted. I realized my sister hadn't stolen from me in her mind. She had accessed a resource. One she'd been taught was available. My stability. My discipline. My effort. Those things weren't respected. They were assumed. And assumptions are dangerous when they go unchallenged. I opened my calendar and started mapping out the next month. Not optimistically. Realistically. What bills could be shifted? What expenses could be delayed? What I would have to sacrifice temporarily to regain balance. As I worked through it, a familiar thought surfaced. I'll make it work. I paused there. 'Cause that sentence had carried me through so much. But it had also been used against me. Every time I survived, it reinforced the idea that I always would. No matter the cost. No matter who benefited. I decided then that survival alone was no longer the goal. Sustainability was. I picked up my phone again and reread my sister's messages. Casual tone. The lack of urgency. The assumption that time would smooth everything over. I imagined what would happen if the roles were reversed. If I had taken money from her account without asking. The outrage. The lectures. The moral framing. I knew exactly how it would play out. 'Cause the rules were different for me. They always had been. I wasn't allowed to be messy. Or impulsive. Or in need. I was allowed to be reliable. Predictable. Convenient. I felt a surge of grief then. Not for the money. For the realization that my role in the family had been clearly defined long before this moment. And I had played it well. Too well. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker on as evening settled in. Other people were going about their lives, unaware that a quiet line had been crossed in mine. That thought grounded me. This wasn't a dramatic betrayal that would be witnessed or validated by others. It was subtle, domestic, easily dismissed, which meant the responsibility to take it seriously rested entirely with me. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What happens if I don't fix this for them anymore? The answer was uncomfortable. They would struggle. They would be inconvenienced. They would be forced to confront limits they had long ignored. And that discomfort had always been redirected toward me instead. I understood then that my discomfort had been the buffer protecting theirs. Removing myself from that role would change the entire dynamic. Not instantly, not peacefully, but inevitably. I sat back down and wrote another list. Not actions this time. Principles. Consent matters even in families. Help is not help if it's taken. Love does not override boundaries. My stability is not communal property. Writing those sentences felt grounding. They weren't demands. They were truths I was finally willing to stand behind. I didn't know how the next conversation would go. I didn't know how much resistance I would face. But I knew this. I was done pretending this was normal. Done minimizing it to keep relationships intact at my expense. Done absorbing losses so others could avoid discomfort. I picked up my phone one more time and drafted a message to my sister. I didn't send it yet. I just wrote it. Clear. Direct. Unapologetic. This was not sharing. It was taking without permission. It can't happen again. Seeing the words there, even unsent, shifted something inside me. I wasn't asking for understanding. I was stating reality. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and accepted a hard truth. This situation wasn't going to resolve itself quietly. 'Cause quiet resolution had always depended on my silence. And I wasn't willing to pay that price anymore. That night stretched longer than it should have. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because my mind refused to go back to the version of reality I had been living in before. Once you see a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. Every attempt to minimize what had happened collapsed under the weight of memory. Moments I had brushed off before came rushing back, lining up neatly like evidence I had ignored on purpose. Times when my sister borrowed money and forgot to mention it. Times when my parents decided things about my life without asking because they assumed I would adjust. Times when my discomfort was treated as overreaction instead of a signal that something was wrong. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the loss of money. It was the certainty that no one had stopped to consider how it would affect me. There had been no internal debate on their side. No hesitation. No, maybe we should ask her first. The decision had been made smoothly, efficiently, without friction. And friction is usually where empathy lives. The absence of it was loud. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside. Normal sounds. Ordinary life. Meanwhile, something fundamental was shifting inside me. I thought about how often I had been praised for being easygoing. How that word had followed me my entire life like a compliment I was supposed to live up to. Easygoing meant adaptable. It meant flexible. It meant low resistance. It also meant exploitable. No one ever says that part out loud. I remembered being younger, watching my sister panic over small inconveniences and seeing how quickly everyone rushed to soothe her. Money would appear. Plans would change. Expectations would soften. And I learned, without being taught directly, that calm people didn't get help. Loud needs were treated as real. Quiet ones were assumed manageable. That lesson had shaped me in ways I was only now beginning to understand. It had taught me to swallow discomfort and call it maturity, to absorb loss and call it responsibility, to accept imbalance and call it love. and suddenly I was done renaming pain into something acceptable. The next morning, I woke up with a headache that sat heavy behind my eyes, the kind that comes from tension rather than illness. I made coffee and stared at my phone, knowing there would be messages waiting. There were. From my sister. Casual updates. A meme. Oh, don't be mad. Nothing acknowledging the seriousness of what she'd done. Nothing acknowledging that $2,000 wasn't pocket change to me. I didn't respond. Not yet. I needed to decide who I was going to be in this conversation before I entered it. 'Cause every past version of me would have tried to soften the edges. Would have reassured everyone that it was okay. Would have prioritized harmony over honesty. I wasn't that version anymore. But stepping into a new role felt risky. Boundaries change dynamics. They introduce friction. They make people uncomfortable. And my family had never responded well to discomfort unless it belonged to someone else. I sat down and wrote out the possible outcomes of speaking up. They might dismiss me. They might accuse me of overreacting. They might flip the narrative and paint me as selfish. They might promise repayment and expect everything to return to normal. None of those outcomes scared me the way they used to, 'cause I finally understood something crucial. No matter how they reacted, the truth wouldn't change. And I wasn't responsible for managing their emotional response to it. That realization felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of walking on something unstable. I thought again about my mom's word. Sharing. That echoed in my head, not as a misunderstanding but as a worldview. In her mind, resources flowed toward need without negotiation. But need was never neutral. Need was assigned based on who was perceived as capable of coping without support. I was always that person. Capable. Resilient. Able to figure it out. Those traits had been weaponized against me. They justified taking without asking. They justified dismissing my boundaries as unnecessary drama. I realized then that asking them to see my perspective might never work, because acknowledging my boundary would require them to question the entire system they had relied on. And systems resist change, especially when they benefit the people in power. That understanding didn't make me feel hopeless. It made me strategic. I didn't need them to agree. I needed them to stop having access, to stop assuming, to stop deciding for me, which meant my next steps weren't about convincing. They were about enforcing. I opened my banking app again and reviewed every connected account. Not with panic. With precision. Anything that allowed shared access was removed. Any convenience that existed solely for their benefit was eliminated. As I worked through it, I felt grief and relief tangled together. Grief for the trust one thought existed. Relief that I was finally acting on reality instead of sentiment. When I finished, I sat quietly and let the feelings settle. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. And for the first time, I wasn't protecting them from discomfort. I was protecting myself from exploitation disguised as family closeness. I knew the conversation was coming. I knew it wouldn't be pleasant. But I also knew this. If I backed down now, this would happen again. In another form. Another amount. Another justification. And I would be right back where I started. So I stayed still. Grounded. Resolved. This wasn't about $2,000 anymore. It was about reclaiming the right to decide what happens to my life, my effort, and my stability. And that right was not negotiable. By the time I accepted that this wasn't an isolated incident, the emotional weight shifted into something heavier and more complex. Anger had burned off. Shock had settled. What remained was reckoning. Kind that forces you to examine not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen at all. I kept asking myself a question that wouldn't let go. How did we get here? Not just to the transfer. To the assumption. to the comfort with which my money was treated as available without discussion. The answer wasn't flattering. Pointed back to me. Not because I was at fault, but because I had been predictable. Predictably forgiving. Predictably adaptable. Predictably silent when something crossed a line. I had confused patience with virtue. I had mistaken self-control for emotional maturity. And I had underestimated how closely people watch what you tolerate, especially family. They don't listen to what you say you deserve. They watch what you accept. And I had accepted too much for too long. I thought about every time I had stepped in quietly to smooth things over. Times I covered expenses without mentioning it. The times I said it's fine when it wasn't. The times I adjusted my plans so others wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable or inconvenienced. Each moment felt small when it happened. Harmless. Almost kind. But stacked together they built a narrative. That I was the safety valve. The one who could absorb pressure without complaint. The one who didn't need to be consulted because she'd adapt anyway. That realization hurt in a way that felt personal and impersonal at the same time. Personal because it was my life. Impersonal because it wasn't about malice. It was about conditioning. I had trained them, unintentionally, to see my boundaries as flexible suggestions rather than fixed lines. And now, for the first time, I was refusing to bend. I spent that afternoon walking through my neighborhood trying to think clearly. Movement helped. Kept the spiral from tightening. As I walked, I noticed how many decisions in my life had been shaped by avoiding conflict. Jobs I stayed in longer than I should have. Conversations I avoided. Needs I delayed. All because I believed peace was something you preserved by making yourself smaller. That belief had served my family well. It had not served me. I stopped at a small park and sat on a bench watching people pass by. Parents with kids. Couples arguing quietly. Someone on the phone gesturing wildly. Normal life. Messy. Unfiltered. And I realized something quietly devastating. Most people don't live their lives constantly preparing to justify their existence. They don't rehearse explanations for their needs. They don't apologize for taking up space before they've even done it. That had been my normal. And it shouldn't have been. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my sister. This one less playful. Mom says you're being cold. Cold. The word made me pause. 'Cause coldness implies cruelty. Distance without feeling. And I knew that wasn't what I was doing. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I was withdrawing access. There's a difference. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her. 'Cause I was still deciding how much of myself I was willing to expose to someone who hadn't shown respect for my boundaries. That night, I sat down and wrote a long message. Not to send. Just to see it. I wrote out exactly how it felt. The fear when I saw the transfer. The frustration of being dismissed. The exhaustion of always being the one expected to recover quietly. Seeing it written out made something inside me settle. 'Cause the truth didn't sound unreasonable. Sounded measured. Clear. Adult. Which meant any attempt to frame me as dramatic would be just that. A framing. Not a fact. I thought about my mom again. About how quickly she had labeled what happened as sharing. That word revealed more than she probably intended. Sharing suggests equality. Mutual benefit. Choice. None of those things had been present. What she really meant was redistribution. From the one who could handle it to the one who couldn't. And I had always been placed in the former category. I realized that as long as I occupied that role, nothing would change. 'Cause the system relied on my silence to function. Breaking silence would introduce instability. And instability is always resisted by those who benefit from the status quo. I wasn't naive about what would come next. There would be pushback. minimization, guilt, accusations of selfishness. They would frame my boundary as betrayal, 'cause it disrupted their access. Knowing this ahead of time didn't make it easy, but it made it survivable. I wasn't walking into the conversation blind anymore. I was walking in informed, prepared, rooted in reality instead of hope. I asked myself one final question before bed that night. If nothing changed after I spoke up, could I live with that? The answer surprised me. Yes, because living with clarity was already better than living with illusion. I turned off the light and lay there, not exactly calm but steady. The kind of steadiness that comes when you finally stop negotiating with yourself. This wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about forcing understanding. It was about deciding once and for all that my boundaries were real even if they made others uncomfortable. And that decision, heavy as it was, felt like the most honest thing I had done in years. The following days unfolded with a strange kind of clarity. Not peace. Not relief. Clarity. Kind that strips excuses down to their bones and leaves nothing soft to hide behind. I went about my routines like normal. Work. Errands. Bills. But underneath everything, there was a steady awareness humming in my chest. I was no longer confused about what had happened. And that changed how everything felt. I noticed how often my phone stayed face down now. How my body tensed whenever I thought about an incoming message. Not fear. Anticipation. Because I knew the next conversation wasn't going to be casual. It was going to be a confrontation with a system that had relied on my compliance for years. And systems do not surrender quietly. I replayed past conflicts in my head, not to relive them but to study them. Every time I had tried to express discomfort before, the same tactics appeared. Deflection, minimization, guilt, a sudden focus on how my reaction made everyone else feel. The original issue always disappeared beneath my tone, my delivery, my timing, and I had let that happen because I believed that being understood required being gentle. I finally saw how that belief had been used against me. Gentleness had become a requirement placed on my pain, while theirs was allowed to be loud. Urgent. Messy. I stopped rehearsing how to explain myself in a way that would be palatable. Instead, I started rehearsing how to stay grounded when they tried to derail the conversation. I practiced saying no without justification. I practiced silence. I practiced letting discomfort exist without rushing to fix it. Those exercises felt unnatural at first, almost wrong, like I was breaking an unspoken family rule. But the more I practiced, the more I understood something crucial. That rule had never protected me. It had protected them from accountability. One afternoon, my mom finally called. Not to apologize. Not to ask how I was doing. To clear the air. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, like we were discussing a misunderstanding over coffee. She talked first. About stress. About how hard things had been lately. About how my sister hadn't meant any harm. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed. 'Cause I wanted to hear exactly how she framed it. When she finished, there was a pause. An opening where I was expected to reassure her. To smooth things over. To restore balance by absorbing the discomfort. I didn't. I said one sentence. That money was taken without my consent, and calling it sharing doesn't make it okay. Silence followed. Thick. Uncomfortable. I could hear her breathing on the other end. Then came the familiar shift. She told me I was being harsh. That family shouldn't keep score. That I was creating division over money. I recognized the move instantly, reframing my boundary as the problem. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I repeated myself slower. I am not discussing intentions. I am stating a boundary. Her frustration surfaced then. She accused me of changing, of being distant, of acting like I was better than them. That accusation hit an old nerve, 'cause it carried shame. But this time I didn't internalize it. I saw it for what it was, a reaction to loss of access. I told her calmly that access to my finances required permission. That permission had been violated, and that it would not happen again. She went quiet, not reflective, calculating. I could feel it. She was deciding whether pushing harder would work. When it didn't, her tone cooled. She said she would talk to my sister. Not apologize. Not acknowledge wrongdoing. Just manage the situation. I ended the call shortly after. My hands were shaking when I set the phone down. Not from fear. From the release of years of swallowed words. I sat there, letting the adrenaline burn off. And something surprising happened. I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired. Deeply tired. Kind of tired that comes after carrying weight for too long and finally setting it down. That conversation didn't fix everything. It didn't magically change my family. But it changed me. 'Cause I had spoken without collapsing. Without apologizing for existing. Without negotiating my reality to keep the peace. That mattered more than any reaction on their end. Later that evening, my sister texted. Short. Defensive. She said she didn't think it was a big deal. That she would pay me back eventually. That mom was upset. I replied once. I don't need eventually. I need consent. She didn't respond after that. And for the first time, I didn't chase resolution. I didn't try to explain further. I let the silence stand. 'Cause silence is only a problem when you believe connection must be maintained at all costs. I was learning that some connections need pressure to reveal their true shape. In the days that followed, I noticed a shift inside myself. I was less reactive, less eager to please, more aware of where my responsibility ended. I stopped anticipating their needs before they voiced them, stopped offering help automatically, stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. And with each small act of restraint, something steadied in me. This wasn't cruelty. It was recalibration. I understood now that boundaries are not punishments. They are filters. They reveal who respects you when access is no longer free. I didn't know how this would end. Whether things would settle into a new normal or fracture permanently. But I knew this. I was no longer willing to bankroll relationships that only functioned when I stayed small. And that decision, as heavy as it was, felt like the beginning of something honest. After that conversation, time behaved differently. Not slower. Heavier. Each day carried a new awareness of where I stood in relation to my family, and that awareness colored everything. I wasn't bracing for disaster anymore. I was observing. Watching how people behave when the rules quietly change. Watching who adapts and who resists. Watching who reaches out with curiosity and who reaches out with control. The silence that followed my boundary was not empty. It was informative. No check-ins. No casual messages. No, just thinking of you. Only logistical communication when it suited them. And that absence said more than any argument ever could. I started noticing how much emotional labor I had been performing without realizing it. Constant monitoring of tone. Careful phrasing. Preemptive reassurance. Without those habits, my days felt strangely spacious. Unfamiliar. Almost unsettling. 'Cause when you stop managing other people's comfort, you suddenly have to confront your own. And I discovered how little practice I had with that. I found myself second-guessing small decisions. Should I reply now? Should I clarify? Should I soften this message? Each time I paused and asked myself a new question. Am I responding out of intention or out of habit? That question became my anchor. At work, I noticed changes too. I spoke more directly in meetings. I stopped volunteering to absorb extra tasks without acknowledgement. When someone pushed a deadline onto me last minute, I didn't rush to comply. I asked what could be deprioritized. The world didn't collapse. No one accused me of being difficult. If anything, I was treated with more respect. That realization landed hard. I had spent years believing that compliance equaled value. But value, I was learning, often increases when access becomes conditional. One evening, I sat down and tried to trace the origin of this dynamic. Not to assign blame. To understand it. I thought about childhood. About how money had always been framed in our house. Scarce when it came to me. Flexible when it came to my sister. I remembered overhearing conversations where my parents praised her for being spirited and expressive, while I was praised for being easy and low maintenance. Those labels felt harmless then. Complimentary even. Now I saw them clearly. One child was allowed to take up space. The other was taught to conserve it. I had internalized that lesson deeply. So deeply that I mistook self-erasure for strength. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Sad for the younger version of me who learned that love was conditional on not needing too much. Sad that it took a financial violation to finally make the pattern undeniable. I also realized something else. My family wasn't confused about my boundary. They understood it perfectly. They just didn't like it. Confusion looks like questions. Clarification. Attempts to understand. What I was seeing instead was avoidance and reframing, which meant they knew exactly what had changed, and they were deciding how to respond to that loss of control. A week later, my dad texted. Short. Carefully neutral. Hope you're doing okay. No acknowledgement of what happened. No apology. No curiosity. Just a temperature check. I stared at the message for a long time. In the past, I would have responded immediately. Grateful for the crumb. Eager to prove that everything was fine. This time I waited. Not to punish. To listen to myself. I replied hours later with one sentence. I'm okay. I'm taking some space to reset. He didn't respond. That silence felt different. It felt final in a way I hadn't anticipated. And for a moment, fear flickered. The old fear. That if I didn't maintain connection, it would disappear entirely. But beneath that fear was something steadier. If a relationship only survives when one person keeps shrinking, it isn't a relationship. It's a dependency. That thought followed me for days. I turned it over in my mind, examining it from every angle. And each time it held. I began to grieve the version of family I had hoped for. Not the one I had. The one I kept believing could exist if I just tried harder. Grief is quieter than anger. Doesn't announce itself. Settles in gradually. In moments when you reach for support and realize it isn't there. In moments when you stop expecting it. That grief was heavy, but it was honest. And honesty, I was learning, is lighter than denial. I spent more time with people who didn't require me to justify my boundaries. Friends who didn't ask me to explain why something hurt. Who didn't need a cost-benefit analysis before offering respect. Around them, I felt my nervous system relax in ways I hadn't noticed before. That contrast was impossible to ignore. It showed me that what I had normalized wasn't universal. It was specific. And optional. One night as I lay in bed, I thought about the word family. How often it's used to excuse behavior that would be unacceptable anywhere else. How easily it becomes a shield against accountability. I realized I no longer wanted to use that word to override my instincts. Family could still mean connection, care, history. But it could not mean access without consent. Could not mean obligation without reciprocity. And it could not mean silence in the face of harm. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no big confrontation, no explosive moment, just a series of quiet decisions, each one pulling me slightly out of a role I had been cast into long ago. I didn't know yet what the final shape of my relationship with them would be. But I knew this version of me was not going back. 'Cause once you experience respect as a baseline instead of a reward, there's no convincing yourself to accept less. And that understanding, slow and heavy as it was, marked a turning point I couldn't undo. By the time I reached this stage, something fundamental had shifted inside me. Not in a loud way. Not in a way that demanded announcement. But in a way that restructured how I interpreted everything that came after. The silence from my family no longer felt like punishment. Felt like data. And data, unlike emotions, can be analyzed without self-blame. I began to notice patterns not just in what they said, but in what they didn't. The absence of accountability. The lack of curiosity. The refusal to engage with the actual issue. These weren't accidents. They were choices. And recognizing them freed me from the exhausting task of trying to fill in the gaps with empathy they hadn't offered. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done consistently in years. Not to vent. To map. I wrote down interactions from the past decade that followed the same structure. Something would happen that benefited them. I would feel uneasy. I would rationalize it. I would adjust. They would move on without consequence. Seeing it laid out on paper was sobering. Stripped away the illusion that this was situational or temporary. It wasn't. It was systemic. I also began to examine how this dynamic had shaped my sense of self. How often I measured my worth by usefulness. How quickly I offered solutions instead of feelings. How instinctively I minimized my own needs to avoid becoming difficult. Those habits didn't form in a vacuum. They were survival strategies in an environment where care was conditional. Understanding that didn't excuse what happened. But it helped me stop internalizing it. I wasn't broken. I was adapted. And adaptations can be unlearned. One afternoon, I met a friend for coffee who hadn't seen me in months. Halfway through our conversation, she paused and said something unexpected. "You're different," she said. Not accusatory. Observational. I asked what she meant. "You don't explain yourself as much," she replied. "You used to justify everything. Now you just state things." That comment stayed with me. 'Cause it confirmed what I had been feeling internally. I was no longer auditioning for understanding. I was simply existing within my own authority. That shift changed how I approached everything, including the idea of forgiveness. I realized I had been taught that forgiveness was something you offered quickly to restore harmony, that withholding it was petty or immature. But forgiveness without accountability had only ever reset the cycle. Taught people that harm had no lasting impact. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone, but I was done pretending trust could be rebuilt without repair. I also confronted a harder truth. Part of me had hoped that drawing a boundary would provoke reflection, that someone would come back with understanding, that there would be a moment of recognition. That hope was fading, and grieving it was necessary, because holding on to it kept me emotionally tethered to an outcome I couldn't control. Letting go didn't mean giving up. It meant redirecting my energy toward what I could influence. My behavior, my access, my expectations. I stopped sharing personal financial details entirely. Stopped offering updates about my life unless asked respectfully. Stopped preemptively reassuring. Each step felt small. But together they formed a boundary that didn't require constant defense. I noticed how uncomfortable this made some people. Not just my family. Others too. People who were used to my openness, my availability, my emotional labor. Some adapted. Some pulled away. Both responses were informative. I was learning that boundaries don't just protect you from harm, they reveal who benefits from your lack of them. Late one night, I reflected on the word sharing again. How casually it had been used to dismiss my experience. True sharing involves choice, consent, mutual respect. What happened to me was entitlement wrapped in familiar language, and that realization sharpened my clarity. I no longer needed them to agree with my interpretation, 'cause my interpretation was grounded in fact. Money had been taken. Permission had not been given. Impact had been dismissed. Those facts didn't change based on intent or relationship. I thought about future scenarios, emergencies, requests, crises. I imagined responding differently, not with immediate solutions, but with questions, with limits, with time to decide. That image didn't scare me anymore. Felt responsible. I was finally allowing myself to be a person instead of a resource. As days turned into weeks, the emotional intensity softened into resolve. Not bitterness, not resentment, resolve. Kind that anchors you when familiar pressures resurface. I wasn't closing the door on my family. I was installing locks. And locks don't mean hostility. They mean choice. I understood now that my silence in the past had been mistaken for consent, my generosity mistaken for obligation, my resilience mistaken for unlimited capacity. Correcting those misconceptions required consistency, not confrontation. And I was prepared for that. This wasn't a phase. It was a recalibration of how I related to the people who had shaped me. I didn't know if they would ever fully understand the shift, but I no longer needed them to, because the most important understanding had already happened. I knew who I was without their approval, and that knowledge, once settled, was impossible to take from me. By the time Part 8 settled into me, the shift was no longer just emotional. It was structural. The way I organized my thoughts, the way I evaluated relationships, the way I understood responsibility. Everything had begun to reorder itself around a new center. Me. Not the version of me shaped by expectation or obligation, but the version grounded in consent, agency, and limits. I began to recognize how much of my life had been lived in anticipation of someone else's reaction. Not just my family's, everyone's. I had been forecasting responses, adjusting myself accordingly, and calling it consideration. In reality, it had been self-erasure dressed up as maturity. That realization was unsettling, 'cause it meant that reclaiming myself would not be limited to one relationship. It would ripple outward. I started noticing how often people were surprised when I didn't over-explain, when I didn't soften a boundary with humor, when I didn't offer a solution to a problem that wasn't mine to solve. Those moments were revealing. Some people leaned in, curious, respectful. Others bristled. Their discomfort wasn't my responsibility, but it was information. And I was learning to read it without judgment. My family, meanwhile, continued to orbit the issue without naming it. There were updates that ignored the conflict entirely. Casual remarks as if nothing had happened. This, too, was familiar. Conflict avoidance disguised as peacekeeping. I recognized it instantly. Pretend nothing changed and maybe the old rules will quietly reassert themselves. I didn't engage. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Engagement without accountability would only reestablish the old dynamic. I thought about the countless times I had been told I was too sensitive. How that phrase had been used to discredit my reactions rather than examine the cause. Sensitivity had been framed as weakness. In truth, it was perception. I noticed what others ignored. I felt what others dismissed. And instead of being supported, I had been trained to doubt myself. That doubt had made me pliable. Easy to override. Easy to take from. Claiming trust in my own perception felt like learning to walk on a leg that had been asleep for years. Word. Unsteady. But necessary. I began revisiting memories with new eyes. Moments that had once felt confusing now made sense. The way praise was given when I sacrificed. The way concern appeared only when I disrupted expectations. Pattern was consistent. Approval was conditional. Autonomy was threatening. Understanding this didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. Precision replaces resentment when you stop arguing with reality. I also confronted a deeper fear. That setting boundaries would make me unlovable. That without my usefulness, I would be discarded. That fear had kept me compliant for years. But now, as days passed without catastrophe, it began to loosen its grip. I saw that the people who valued me only when I was convenient were already not loving me fully. They were loving access, loving benefit, loving comfort. That distinction mattered. I spent time alone intentionally, not isolating, choosing solitude. I listened to my own preferences without rushing to justify them. What did I want? What felt aligned? What felt draining? Those questions had once seemed indulgent. Now they felt essential. I noticed how my body responded when I honored my own limits. Less tension, more presence, quiet sense of integrity settling in. This wasn't about becoming rigid or cold. It was about becoming congruent. I no longer wanted my actions to contradict my values. I reflected on the concept of loyalty, how it had been framed as endurance, as staying no matter what, as absorbing harm quietly. But loyalty without mutual respect is not virtue. It's submission. And submission is often rewarded with more demands, not gratitude. That truth was uncomfortable but freeing. It allowed me to redefine loyalty as something reciprocal, something chosen, something that could be withdrawn when trust was violated. I thought about the future again, not in terms of reconciliation or distance, but in terms of choice. If my family wanted a relationship with me, it would require new rules. Rules that acknowledged my autonomy, rules that respected consent, rules that didn't rely on my silence to function. Whether they accepted those rules was not something I could control, but enforcing them was. I also recognized something quietly powerful. I was no longer angry about the money. $2,000 had become symbolic. Catalyst. What mattered now was what it had revealed. The imbalance, the entitlement, the assumptions baked into our relationships. And once revealed, those things could not be unseen. I began to trust myself in a way I hadn't before. Not blindly, but deliberately. I trusted my interpretation of events, trusted my emotional responses as signals, not flaws, trusted my right to protect what I had built through discipline and effort. That trust extended beyond this situation. It informed how I showed up everywhere. I no longer felt the need to prove my worth through sacrifice. I no longer equated love with endurance. I no longer believed that being the bigger person meant shrinking myself. As Part 9 settled, I understood that this process wasn't about one boundary. It was about reclaiming authorship over my life. About deciding consciously who gets access and under what conditions. That authorship felt heavy at times. Responsibility often does. But it also felt honest, grounded, real. And for the first time, the path forward didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I had chosen. By the time Part 9 had fully settled, I realized the shift wasn't just internal anymore. It was visible. Subtle but visible. In the way I moved through conversations. In the way I paused before responding. In the way I no longer rushed to close gaps that weren't mine to fix. Change had texture now. Weight. Consequences. I noticed how people recalibrated around me when my old patterns didn't show up. Some tested the edges. Some pulled back. Some adjusted quietly and stayed. Each reaction told me something important. Who had relied on my compliance? Who respected my autonomy? Who confused access with intimacy? This wasn't a loss. It was a sorting. And sorting is uncomfortable only when you've been taught to keep everything together at any cost. My family continued to behave as if time would erase the problem. As if silence would smooth the edges. As if the discomfort I introduced would fade if they simply waited long enough. I recognized the strategy immediately. Delay accountability. Normalize the absence of repair. Resume contact on their terms. I didn't bite. Not because I wanted conflict, but because peace built on avoidance is fragile. Cracks the moment pressure returns. I had lived in that fragility long enough. One afternoon, my mom sent a message that seemed harmless on the surface. A photo of something mundane. A comment about the weather. No reference to what had happened. No acknowledgement. Just a gentle tug on the old thread. I felt the familiar impulse to respond warmly. To show that I wasn't holding a grudge. To prove that I was still safe. I let the impulse pass. Not suppressing it. Observing it. I asked myself a question that had become central to everything. Does responding this way move me closer to integrity or closer to habit? The answer was clear. I didn't respond. That silence wasn't punishment. It was alignment. For the first time, my actions matched what I actually felt. And that congruence was grounding in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized then how much energy I had spent managing perceptions. How exhausting it had been to constantly reassure others that I was fine, grateful, unbothered. That performance had cost me more than the money ever did. Letting it go freed up space I didn't know I had. Space to think. Space to rest. Space to decide. I also confronted a difficult truth. Part of me had equated distance with cruelty. I had been taught that closeness meant constant availability. That love meant unlimited access. But what I was experiencing now didn't feel cruel. It felt honest. Boundaries weren't creating distance. They were clarifying where connection was actually possible. Without resentment. Without self-betrayal. That distinction mattered. I spent time reflecting on what repair would even look like. Not apologies. Not promises. She'll change. Acknowledgement of harm. Respect for consent. A shift in assumptions. Without those elements, reconciliation would be cosmetic. And I wasn't interested in cosmetics anymore. I wanted substance. Whether it came or not would determine the future shape of our relationship. I accepted that outcome without panic. 'Cause I had already survived worse. I had survived being unseen while present. That was harder than distance ever could be. As weeks passed, I felt myself becoming more selective with my energy. Not guarded. Intentional. I invested in relationships where my boundaries were met with understanding instead of resistance. Where care wasn't conditional on my silence. Where my no didn't require justification. Those relationships felt different. Calmer. More reciprocal. They showed me what had been missing all along. Not love. Respect. I realized then that respect isn't loud. Doesn't announce itself. Shows up in small, consistent behaviors. In asking before taking. In listening without reframing. In adjusting behavior when harm is named. Those behaviors had been absent in my family dynamic. Naming that didn't make me disloyal. It made me honest. I also stopped romanticizing endurance. Stopped telling myself that staying and absorbing was noble. There is nothing noble about neglecting yourself to keep others comfortable. That's not strength. It's abandonment. Self-abandonment. And I had done enough of that for a lifetime. One evening, as I sat quietly, I felt a sense of closure begin to form. Not an ending, a stabilization. I didn't need resolution to move forward. I needed clarity. And I had it. Clarity about what I would no longer tolerate. Clarity about what I deserved. Clarity about the difference between love and entitlement. This process hadn't made me harder. It had made me more exact, more aligned, more whole. I wasn't withdrawing from connection. I was choosing the conditions under which it could exist without costing me myself. Part 10 settled, I understood something essential. Boundaries don't end relationships. They end illusions. And once illusions fall, what remains is either real enough to rebuild on or honest enough to walk away from. Either way, I would be standing in truth. And that finally felt like solid ground. By the time I reached this point, I understood that what was happening was not a phase, a reaction, or a temporary emotional adjustment. It was a permanent reorientation of how I related to the world, to people, to power, to myself. The old instinct to negotiate my worth had gone quiet, not because it had been silenced, but because it had finally been disproven. I no longer believed that explaining myself better would lead to better treatment. I no longer believed that endurance earned respect. I no longer believed that love required me to absorb harm without protest. Those beliefs had governed my life for years. Letting them go felt like shedding an identity I had mistaken for character. I began to see how deeply the narrative of being the strong one had infiltrated everything. Strength had never meant support. It had meant capacity. How much could I handle without asking? How much could I lose without complaining? How much could I give without receiving? And once you are labeled strong, people stop checking if you're okay. They assume you are. They rely on it. They build systems around it. My family had done exactly that. They hadn't just benefited from my resilience. They had depended on it. Removing that foundation destabilized the structure, which is why the resistance was subtle but persistent, not explosive, quiet, disapproving, passive. I felt it in the absence of warmth, in the carefully neutral messages, in the way concern was replaced with distance. That distance used to scare me. Now it clarified something essential. Connection that cannot survive accountability is not connection. It's convenience. And convenience is fragile. It evaporates the moment access is restricted. I also recognized how often guilt had been used as a management tool. Not intentionally, but effectively. Guilt kept me compliant, made me question my reactions, reframed boundaries as selfishness, suggested that prioritizing myself was a moral failure. That framing had worked because I cared deeply about being fair, about being good, about not becoming someone who only thinks about herself. But fairness without reciprocity is exploitation. And goodness that requires self-erasure is not virtue. That realization settled slowly, like sediment in water. Once clear, it changed how I interpreted every past interaction. I stopped asking, was I too harsh? I started asking, was I clear? I stopped worrying about how my boundaries were received. I started evaluating whether they were respected. That shift was profound, because it moved the locus of control back to where it belonged, with me. I noticed how my nervous system responded to this new posture. Less hypervigilance, less anticipation of conflict, less internal rehearsal. I wasn't bracing anymore. I was standing. That didn't mean everything felt easy. It meant everything felt honest. There were moments of loneliness, moments where I missed the illusion of closeness, moments where I wished things could be simpler. But simplicity built on denial had cost me too much already. I chose complexity with integrity over comfort with self-betrayal. That choice didn't make me cold. It made me precise. I also began to understand the generational layer of all this. How patterns replicate when they're unexamined. How entitlement often disguises itself as tradition. How families normalize imbalance by calling it just how things are. Someone has to interrupt that cycle. An interruption is rarely rewarded in the moment. But it is necessary. Even if it costs closeness. Even if it costs approval. Even if it costs the role you were given. I accepted that I might never receive a clean apology. That accountability might remain partial or absent. That some people would cling to their version of events to avoid discomfort. That acceptance didn't feel like defeat. It felt like realism. And realism is grounding. I no longer needed validation to proceed. I had internal alignment. That was enough. I thought about future versions of myself. Person I would be 5 years from now. 10. I imagined her looking back at this moment, not asking why I stayed, but why I waited so long to leave the role that was draining me. That imagined perspective gave me strength. It reminded me that this wasn't just about now. It was about trajectory, about what I was modeling for myself, about the standards I was setting for future relationships. I understood now that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks. They allow you to choose who enters and under what conditions. They preserve energy for relationships that can meet you with respect. They protect your capacity to give freely instead of compulsively. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was reclaiming agency. And agency changes everything. As part 11 settled into me, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the steady peace of alignment. Peace that comes when your actions, values, and self-respect no longer contradict each other. I didn't know how part 12 would unfold yet, but I knew this. Whatever came next would not be shaped by fear, guilt, or obligation. It would be shaped by choice. And that, more than anything else, marked the end of who I had been forced to be, and the beginning of who I was choosing to become. By the time I reached this final stage, I understood that nothing about this process had been accidental. Every moment of discomfort, every pause, every silence, every boundary tested and resisted, all of it had been necessary to dismantle a version of myself that had been built for survival rather than truth. I was no longer asking who I was to my family. I was answering who I was to myself. And that answer no longer required permission. I reflected on how long I had lived with the belief that harmony was something you protected by yielding. That peace was fragile and had to be maintained by whoever cared the most. I had been that person. Caretaker of emotional equilibrium. The absorber of imbalance. The one who quietly recalibrated so others wouldn't have to. Letting go of that role felt like stepping out of a costume I had worn for so long I forgot it wasn't my skin. I examined the word responsibility with new eyes. I had been taught that responsibility meant fixing what broke, regardless of who caused it. But responsibility without agency is not responsibility. It is burden. And I had carried burdens that were never mine to begin with. Understanding this shifted something fundamental. I no longer felt compelled to rescue situations that excluded my consent. I no longer felt guilty for declining roles that required my self-erasure. I no longer confused obligation with love. That confusion had cost me years. I thought about the younger version of myself who learned early that being low maintenance earned approval. Who learned that needs were negotiable if they interfered with someone else's comfort. Who learned to interpret neglect as normal and attention as conditional. I wished I could go back and tell her that she wasn't difficult. She was just inconvenient in a system that prioritized ease over fairness. I couldn't go back. But I could honor her by refusing to repeat the pattern. That realization brought a sense of closure deeper than forgiveness ever could. Forgiveness implies release of anger. What I experienced was release of illusion. Illusion that sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. Illusion that silence would be understood. Illusion that love required endurance. Releasing those beliefs felt like reclaiming oxygen. I also acknowledged something uncomfortable but honest. My family might never fully understand my shift. They might reinterpret it, minimize it, frame it in ways that protected their self-image. And that was not something I could control. Control had never actually been available to me in this dynamic. What was available was choice. And I was choosing clarity over approval, integrity over proximity, self-respect over familiarity. Those choices weren't dramatic. They were consistent. And consistency, I learned, is what actually changes lives. Not declarations, not confrontations, but sustained alignment. I noticed how my inner dialogue had changed. Where I once asked, "Am I being unfair?" I now asked, "Am I being honest?" Where I once worried about disappointing others, I now evaluated whether I was disappointing myself. That internal recalibration became my compass. Guided decisions large and small, from finances to relationships, to how much access I allowed anyone to my time, energy, and emotional labor. I understood now that boundaries are not reactions. They are values in action. And values don't require debate. They require consistency. I thought about the future again. Not in terms of reconciliation or distance, but in terms of sustainability. What kind of life could I build if I stopped leaking energy into systems that didn't replenish it? What kind of relationships could I cultivate if respect was the baseline instead of the reward? What kind of peace was possible if I no longer betrayed myself to keep others comfortable? Those questions no longer frightened me. They energized me. 'Cause for the first time the answers were within my control. I also recognized something quietly profound. This process had not made me less loving. It had made me more discerning. I was still capable of generosity, still capable of care, still capable of deep connection. But now those things flowed from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than depletion. That distinction changed everything. I no longer feared becoming too much or too cold. Those labels belonged to people who benefited from my lack of boundaries. They no longer defined me. I thought again about the moment when the money was taken and called sharing. That moment had been the spark. But the fire that followed had illuminated far more than a single incident. Revealed the architecture of my relationships, the hidden assumptions, the unequal expectations, quiet entitlement masked as familiarity. Seeing that architecture allowed me to step out of it. And once you step out, you can't unknow what you know. I accepted that some bridges might never be rebuilt, and that some didn't deserve to be. Not every connection is meant to be preserved. Some exist to teach you where your limits are. And learning that lesson is not failure. It is growth. As I stood in this final stage, I felt a steadiness that didn't depend on anyone else's reaction. A groundedness that came from internal alignment rather than external validation. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies. Not for understanding. Not for permission. I was living according to standards I had finally claimed as my own. That didn't make life perfect, but it made it honest. And honesty, I learned, is the most durable foundation there is. I didn't need to announce this transformation. It would be visible in my choices, in what I allowed, in what I declined, in how I showed up without shrinking. The story didn't end with reconciliation or revenge. It ended with reclamation, of voice, of agency, of self-respect. And that ending was quieter than I once imagined. But it was stronger, because it didn't rely on anyone else changing. It relied on me finally refusing to abandon myself.